In our previous segment, we saw that the Globalize Intifada movement has begun to show its call for violent attacks against Jews all over the world. But why haven't we heard about it more in the media? And why haven't social media companies taken this as seriously as it should be, as the call for violence against Jewish people around the world? The media has talked about these one-off attacks against Jews in the streets by pro-Palestinian protesters, but talks little about the growing calls by these groups for the larger plan to export their hate against Jews around the world. The Globalize Intifada movement, like its predecessors, has become a form of sanctioned racism against Jewish people. Think about if we simply replace the word Jew in this situation with another group. Like imagine if we used Ukrainians calling for mass violent attacks against Russians around the world due to the current conflict in Eastern Europe. This would likely make front page news and probably be on every evening news report. For some reason, when the Palestinians and their supporters call for mass attacks or an intifada against Jews around the world, we hear complete silence from the media. Imagine for a second if the Jewish people around the world or the Israeli government went onto social media demanding that all Jews around the world take up arms against Palestinians and pro-Palestinian Arabs. You can bet that it would be on every 24-hour news station. The double standard is evident, but why is the Western media so afraid to call out the racism and hate? We saw them speak about the hate against the people of Asian heritage during the pandemic, but nothing for the Jews, which ironically was happening at the same time. In my personal opinion, the media likes to appear like they're not choosing a side on the Israel-Palestine conflict. For some reason, taking the side of the perceived underdog is a way to seem more unbiased. As an example, we can see any story about Hamas shooting rockets at civilians and the Israeli forces taking out the location where the rocket was fired from can be portrayed in two different ways, depending on the report. One report may say Israeli rockets destroy Palestinian homes. Another might say about the incident Palestinian rockets hit Israeli school and Israel responds. Each media source chooses how to represent that same story. Sadly, we too often see the anti-Israel version on most television and media sources. Many choose to take the side of the suggested, quote, victims of the conflict, which is always the Palestinians, as the quote-unquote underdog. Of course, for the record, Palestinian people are 100% victims of this situation. Their own leadership shoots rockets into Israel and provokes a response where Palestinians are threatened to stay in their homes to be used as cannon fodder by their government, who stay safely far away from the whole conflict. These Palestinian people deserve much better. Since the media often paints the Palestinians as the victims in their reports, it sadly does not fit their narrative to speak about the pro-Palestinian movement calling for the harm and death of Jews around the world. It becomes a little difficult to justify the innocence and victimhood of the Palestinian people in this situation. Since the media are unable to be fair and impartial on some of these issues, they avoid speaking about the topic entirely. Even these biased media sources would have difficulties justifying a call to attack innocent civilians around the world just based on their religion. At least when these attacks are happening in the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, the media sources can spin things, somehow blaming the Israelis for the alleged poor treatment of Palestinians. But an attack on a Jewish man eating sushi in Los Angeles, it's a bit more difficult to spin that, to suggest that this man deserves to be violently threatened. Many of these media sources would gladly call out the Israeli government for any and all actions that they see as negative, but rarely ever speak about issues caused by Palestinian leadership, including the harm to civilians. I assume that any mention of the Palestinian side's culpability in the calls for violence against innocent civilians would bring down the one-sided narrative that they have built over the last number of years. If people began to know the facts and issues caused by the Palestinians against Jews and their fellow Palestinians, the media narrative will begin to crumble, and people may start to begin asking questions about what they've been told about this situation in the past. The media may begin to be called out for their bias in the past and have all their credibility ruined. I think they've gone in too deep on the idea that the Palestinians are perpetual victims and have done nothing wrong and will never do anything wrong. They can't turn back now. So they have to keep presenting this same idea, no matter what the circumstance. In the end, to attempt to use social media and the internet to call for a, quote, global intifada against all Jews around the world shows the real face of the pro-Palestinian movement, as for the most part an anti-Semitic movement. If this movement was really looking for peace, they would not be calling for violence. We also need to call out the media as a whole, who should be ashamed of itself for supporting anti-Semitism by ignoring the call for violence against the world Jewish population. Globalizing the Intifada needs to be called out for globalizing anti-Semitism. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to check out our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. And don't forget to follow us on social media at jdr.podcast. We'll see you next time.